today we have some good friends of mine. Very happy to have Anuj Hasija from Novartis and Carlo Yuvienco from Envisagenics. He has also worked with the NYC EDC that you've probably heard so much about. Elsie earlier today worked previously at the EDC. You also heard from Miko yesterday. So it's our last event. Unfortunately, Liliana, who was meant to be our third panelist, cannot make it. She had an emergency, a work emergency, so it'll just be the three of us. We want to keep it a little casual. So we may be asking you some questions just to get a little bit of a sense from you all where you stand or what are your interests. So we're going to be, how about we ask the audience a couple of questions first so you know who you're talking to, and then I'll invite you both to introduce yourselves. So I'm going to ask a question. I'll ask a couple of questions, so maybe by show of hands. And I know you've answered this question before, but we have new audience members or new panelists here. How many of you are undergraduate students currently? And hands down, how many of you are graduate students? Okay, how many of you are neither? You have recently graduated. Yes, we have congratulations, recent grads. Okay, and how many of you are STEM majors? I think that's most. Any non-STEM majors? A couple shaking their hands, waving to us. You're going back and forth. Do you mind, Jade, telling us what you mean, where you're kind of debating?
Well, my major is psychology, so I don't know if that falls under STEM. I know it's a social science, but I don't know if it's like a hardcore like science, so I don't know where I would fit in with that.
That is a very good point. I think it is technically social sciences, so I think that's technically outside of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But I know you have to take a lot of math for it and statistics, so thank you for being here. And what's your...
Scientific writing, so it's kind of a mixture of science classes and journalism classes.
Okay, so we also have science writing in here. Excellent.
We actually do. Yeah. Playing good first. Yeah. Actually, coincidentally, we do need a scientific writer. We were looking for somebody to review and just double check a paper that we're trying to publish. So there is a market out there for scientific writers in that skill set, for sure.
Do you have any questions you would like to ask of the audience?
Well, you covered sort of my big curiosities of where people are. How many people are, and I know that this may be one of the directions you're going with in terms of the questions, but how many people are sort of local to New York or born and raised in New York, and how many are new to the city? So let's go with how many are born and raised in New York or the area? Okay? And then how many people sort of went to school here, are going to school here, but are from another part of the country or world? Hey, all right. I have to ask that because of my EDC roots. Do you want to segue into introductions?
Let me see. Anuj, do you have any other questions before we get started?
You have intros? Yeah. Okay. So I'll go first. As Anita said, my name is Carlo Yuvienco. I'm with a company called Envisagenics. I am Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships on the business development team with that company. It is an early stage biotech located here in New York City. We're currently at J Labs, which is a Johnson & Johnson sponsored incubator in Lower Manhattan. But we are soon to cut the ribbon on our brand new lab office facilities in Long Island City. So we're excited about that. As Anita also mentioned, I formerly worked at the New York City Economic Development Corporation, so I did some partnership and business development activities for the city of New York. But my training and sort of what I spent the majority of my post-grad years in is in the sciences. I did a PhD in biomedical engineering, which was a follow-up to a brief stint in industry and a bachelor's in engineering and chemical engineering. And then after a postdoc, that's when I found my way to New York City government and doing what I loved for the last 6 years and getting to work with these folks at Upper West. So So I'll leave it at that in
Can you
case.
share the universities? I think we may have some.
Sure. Some alumni in the audience. So I went to undergrad for a bachelor's in engineering at Cooper Union for chemical engineering. Nice. Oh, chemical. Very nice. And then I went to grad school at Camden School of Engineering at NYU during the merger actually between NYU and Polytechnic. So when I joined, it was still Brooklyn Polytechnic.
Super happy to be here. My name's Anuj. I'm also a chemical engineer. So I did my chemical engineering undergrad and grad in Michigan, so go blue. And I spent approximately 2 years of my career actually doing any engineering whatsoever. So please don't ask me anything that has to do with understanding the science. No, so I worked in engineering for a couple years and I really gravitated towards the business side. And I ended up getting an MBA. I went into consulting, and for the past more than 10 years I've been working for a company called Novartis, which is a big pharmaceutical company. In fact, I met Anita at Novartis. And it's funny, you don't plan out, like you think you're planning out your career and then things happen to you. So I happened to get a job in Munich, Germany, of all places in the world. And I met Anita, of all places, in Munich, Germany. And now we're both living here in New York. And so it's really cool talking to folks who are at the beginning of a long, cool career journey, because when you look back at your progress every 5-10 years, you'll say, oh my God, what did I do? And I think you'll be really surprised by everything you've accomplished. Probably even now, some of you have already graduated, just the journey you've got to get there. And in another 5 years, you'll be able to do really cool stuff too. So I guess my message just to start out is, like, there's an endless number of things you can do. And if you pick something and try to be great at it, it's not like that's the end of the world, you can't do anything else. You have a lot of ways you can pivot way into your career as long as you keep learning and growing and be curious. So that's my spiel.
Great.
Thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit on oncology in New York City. Why did you choose to work in New York City? We'll start there and maybe follow that. Yeah, well, let's start with New York City first.
You're hardcore.
I'm hardcore New York City, I am. Well, look, I think it's a pretty obvious and somewhat dull answer, but I think there's a lot of meaning behind it, is that I am born and raised in New York. I've been a fan of this town, and it's one of those things, it's a big cliche, but like it's, for a lot of born and raised New Yorkers, it's sort of the best town in the world, and best city and best place to live, even though it has its own issues like any other city. And so, I just wholeheartedly love this place, blemishes and all. And after seeing and visiting other cities, both here and also other countries in the world, realizing that every place has its own problems. And I think the last 6 years of my time with EDC, I got to realize that it isn't easy running a city, but the fact that there is good government here, constantly trying to improve our living conditions, our working conditions, our opportunities, that just makes it even a stronger argument for me.
Yeah, so I grew up until 2nd grade. I finished just outside Atlanta. And then my family moved to New Jersey, South Jersey, near Philly, when I was in, 3rd grade. And I've been there ever since. So Philly was really my city growing up. But you kind of find especially when you go to healthcare, there are a ton of companies in the kind of tri-state area, in particular New Jersey. And I've found really great jobs in New Jersey, and I've chosen to live in New York, pay a lot more in rent, and do the reverse commute. So a lot of my coworkers think I'm crazy. But then you find ones who've done the same, and we have happy hours and stuff in the city. It's really cool. I love the city because I think growing up, I kind of have two cultures, right? My family's from India, but I was born and raised here. And I really enjoy like the diversity of different cultures and getting to experience people from all different parts of the world. And New York's such an amazing place. And now having lived all over the world, I've lived in Germany, I've lived in the Philippines, I've lived all across the US and traveled a lot. I mean, not being in New York feels weird, right? So I find it the other way around. Like, so I live in Brooklyn now. We moved from the Upper West Side to Brooklyn just over the pandemic, and I drive an hour and a half to work in New Jersey. Luckily, the last 2 years I did less driving. Yeah, so I find New York amazing, and then you find people here who are similarly curious, who are ambitious, who, you know, kind of want to see things that they haven't seen before. And so I like being around that.
Of that curiosity, I think it came up in the last conversation. I think it's been coming up with all of our panelists. So I would like to turn a little bit to that international focus, because you've worked in a lot of different places. What opportunities and challenges do you see that working in life sciences in New York City presents, perhaps versus other places where you've worked? I may have a slight tweak on that for Carlo.
Yeah, I don't know if it presents a lot of challenges other than how much you got to pay to live, because there are so many life science companies in the area. Many of them are in the suburbs, so you can do what I do, which is to commute. And I think, you know, what Carlo's doing and what I might choose to do in the future, which is going to more like startups and biotechs, that universe lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts primarily. But there are still there's a nice community here in New York, so you have smaller community that you can be closer to, and a smaller group of people that you can be connected to, but then the center of gravity is not that far away in Boston. And all the big pharma companies, healthcare companies, I think 80% of them are pretty much within driving distance of the city. So I think the city is a great place for it, and I'm really curious how the city evolves, because it was a city driven by the financial sector, and now tech companies are changing things, biotech companies are changing things, and so, I mean, you guys are going to be the ones who can help create the next version of New York, and that's what's so cool about New York is it's constantly evolving, and I don't know what New York looks like the next 10 years. Even this close, it's changing pretty fast. So I'm excited about it.
Yeah, you reminded me that New York City has a lot of other industries, both anchor industries, sort of the what we used to call them at EDC fire industries. They were finance, insurance, and real estate, which were the sort of staple industries in which the New York City economy was built upon. But then starting, really during the Bloomberg administration, which was the mayor before de Blasio, did we start to diversify with a lot of firepower and capital. And so that included new initiatives in fashion, that included new initiatives in food security, tech, obviously, with the growth of Google, and then others following, other FANG companies following, and now biotech, and a significant real estate footprint for biotech. And so what's interesting about New York City that distinguishes it from the centers of gravity of both Cambridge and also the Bay Area for both life sciences, and the Bay Area for tech and also life sciences, is that there's an opportunity in New York City for the convergence of a lot of different disciplines and industries, where engineering particularly can coincide with people who are material scientists in the fashion industry and come up with novel materials. And then you'll start seeing, hopefully, and then this is one of the predictions that we made back when I was with EDC not too long ago, is that you'll start to see the Department of Defense start funding projects and programs in New York City that really double down on that intersection. But there's also sort of, gravitating to just the center of just pure biotech. There is an emerging cluster here. It's a small community, which is nice. It's a little bit more intimate. We all support each other, and it's a little less cutthroat, I would say. And even though the opportunities right now may not be as plentiful as Cambridge, I think there's less of a revolving door. I think that's also a bit of a reality of the labor market in New York City, for biotech at least, is that if somebody joins a biotech here, they're there to stay for a while. They're not like Cambridge, where you find folks maybe looking for another job that's literally across the street or even the same building even. So that's sort of my perspective on differences between New York City and other places.
And maybe just a thought that came from that. Like, I feel like I got so much out of traveling internationally and moving a lot. One thing I felt like I missed out on was like building a community near where I live, because there's always moving. And that thought on biotech in New York made me think of one of my best friends. So he also grew up with me in South Jersey, but he lives a few blocks away from me in Brooklyn. And his job is in Hollywood, basically. So he's a Hollywood editor, does all big films and you know, Netflix and all that stuff. And the center of gravity for his industry is in Hollywood. But he's been saying, I want to stay in New York, this is where I feel good. And there is an industry here which caters to all the production events that happen in New York. And so then he's one of the go-to people for New York. And then he's got his community of folks who all work in the industry that are in New York, and it's a little bit like closer knit. And yeah, so he kind of did a couple stints in LA and then came back, and he loved the fact that he could build, you know, a group of folks he really enjoyed being with in New York City.
Very cool. So I'm hearing a few things. So knowing your passion, having a network, and knowing where various opportunities are nearby. I do want to bring it back to oncology. So we have a lot of scientists in the audience, mostly scientists, a lot of biofolk, bioengineers. How did you get into oncology?
You take this one first?
Sure. Well, I should say that Envisagenics is an AI platform company. What we're doing with AI is discovering targets, druggable targets ideally, and it spans oncology, and that's just by nature of the type of data space that we're exploring, which is RNA sequencing data. And in the RNA sequencing data, we're specifically targeting splicing defects in RNA, and sort of the first tranche of our analysis is to do spliceosomal profiling, so profiling errors in the spliceosome, which is a multi-protein complex that's responsible for the splicing actions. And when there are defects in that machinery that typically exists in oncology, or there are a lot of defects in that in oncology that then sort of trickle down into splicing defects later on. So that's sort of a byproduct of the science and the approach. But then there are also other indications in disease areas that splicing is also emerging as a factor and a contributor. There's some neuro work that we're doing in ALS and Parkinson's. It's pretty early stage, but we're starting to see evidence in both the literature and as well as our own findings that there's splicing defects there, and then metabolic. Right now, particularly NASH and NAFLD, so fatty liver disease, for those who are not familiar.
And I took a different track. Just maybe stepping back in the industry, worldwide essentially, all of the medicines that we create, all these therapies, people do it, it works in capitalism because there's an incentive. And that incentive is that you have patent protection, which means if you find something, you can be the one that reaps the rewards when you sell it in the marketplace for a number of years that no one else can enter. And that's worked fantastic. But there's a second part to it, which is how do you bring these great innovations and changes in science to change people's lives, right? So when things are patent protected, you're learning in smaller groups and you're changing the lives of those first folks who actually get to try it. But if you've been around the world like me, there are billions of people who need these medicines. So there's a whole other side of it, which is how do you take the science and make it scalable and affordable for people around the world. And so my first, it also was not like a plan in oncology specifically, where I now ended up specializing more. But one of the groups of products I worked on early was our cancer medicines. And one thing that's really interesting I talk about if you look back after 10 years. I mean, 10 years ago, there weren't that many products to choose from. Here we are 10 years later, and we're acting like, oh, it's totally normal that I'm leading like a whole bunch of products that everybody already knows about. And so the science of oncology and treating oncology has grown massively over just 10 years. And when I started in Munich, part of my job was also to kind of change the world to say, hey, some of these medicines in oncology are biologics. All of our regulations worldwide about how you can get generics into the marketplace did not include biologics, which meant by definition, pharma companies would be a patent-protected monopoly forever. And then there would be no way for people to be able to afford it eventually. And so we went around the world, talked to regulators, created a framework for how do you take something more complicated than a small molecule drug and still prove that you can make a copy of it and it still can be safe and it still can be effective without running, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of clinical trials. And so we did that, and that's what I did all across Asia Pacific and Latin America and influenced our activities in Europe and US. And now it's a big industry about how do you now launch copies of biologic medicines in oncology. And then after that experience, I was really curious about, going back to the innovative side, what's really driving innovation in oncology. I really love the space. I think all of us have family and friend stories, unfortunately, in the cancer space nowadays. So I was inspired to go research and see what's new. And so I moved over to our division, which does new oncology medicines within Novartis 3 years ago. And I've been just helping us make better versions of our drugs. So in oncology, what's interesting is there's so much unmet need out there. People are dying because there's no medicine. So when you're trying to get a medicine to market, it doesn't spend that long in clinic. It's literally handfuls of people you try it on just so you can get it to the first patients in the marketplace. And that means there's not a lot of time to do good design. And so one thing my team does is say, hey, we don't need to stop after the first launch product. We can adapt that product so it's better for patients. So for example, a lot of drugs have food effect. You can't eat for like hours before and after. Well, imagine you need to do that 2 or 3 times a day, right? And then you've got other drugs which have different interactions. So can you make it better for experience with cancer patients so they can stay on treatment and stay healthy? And so that's what I work on now. But again, it wasn't like a plan.
Well, Anuj, you mentioned different kinds of products. So I just want to ask the audience, are you familiar with the difference between small molecule, biologics, biosimilars, which is a different category? Does anybody not know what Anuj meant when he was referring to some of these different types? Anybody unfamiliar? It's okay if you're unfamiliar. Okay. Would anyone like to explain small molecule versus biologics?
Yeah.
And biosimilars.
Yeah, so I won't be very good at this, but so it's traditionally, how would I describe a small
I
molecule?
can do that.
So
Yeah, let Carlo.
why do you do small molecules and not do biology?
Yeah, so think of organic chemistry class, right? The types of chemicals, small, sort of, let's say less than 200 atoms in a particular chemistry. And so that is typically what a small molecule is or will look like. A biologic will be something along the lines of a protein-based therapy, right? So something that has a complexity that's ordained from nature. I don't know, are DNA and RNA therapies considered biologics as well, or would you call them advanced therapies?
Separate category.
Separate category, right? Gene therapies. So, but biologics, think of that as proteins, right? Antibodies are a big class of that, and then think of small molecules as what you see in an organic chemistry textbook. I don't know how more simply to put it.
Yeah, so like a small molecule aspirin is a small molecule. And biologics, because they're complex proteins that are quite large, they're not easy to manufacture through a chemical process, so you typically have a biologic process. So for example, you'll use yeast to express a certain genome in order to then generate that protein. And that means it's a lot more complicated and it's a mixture of different things. So how do you prove that if I made it, the original manufacturer, that it's the same thing? If he tries to copy mine, how do we know it's the same thing? So the aspirin, we can literally do GC or something and see directly. It's very easy to characterize. And in biologics, people thought, well, that's too complicated to characterize. But everything's really about resolution, and we're in 2022. We can see a lot. So the idea around a biosimilar, so maybe stepping back, for an oral solid small molecule like an aspirin, you'd be able to go to FDA and say, hey, look, my product's the same. See, the chemical composition looks the same. I don't need to go run a 1,000-person clinical trial like he did. I want you to judge me based on what my drug looks like, and it looks like his. So that idea should apply also to biologics, but it's a little bit more complicated because they're bigger, more complex molecules, they're mixtures. So how do you know what component, which part of the molecule to look at to say it's going to behave the same as his? And that's where the concept of a biosimilar comes in. And the FDA, we worked with them, for example, and in the EMA, which was what's the totality of evidence? What is the fingerprint? So can we look at 4, 5, 6 different characters of the molecules to compare both of them? And if they look the same on those dimensions, we can feel like they will behave the same in the body, whether it's his product or my product, and you can use them interchangeably. And I don't need to do a whole bunch of clinical trials to prove that. Because once you need to run a clinical trial, then you need tons of money, and then you no longer have an affordable medicine, right? So that's sort of the difference. It's a difference really in molecule size, and then therefore questions about how can you guarantee it's the same.
So what they were just explaining, what Anuj was just explaining, is a little about the regulatory framework of approval, and even creating. You had to create a regulatory framework in Europe because these molecules didn't really exist. Now, Carlo, what kind of products do you all sell, or is it more research or platforms? So can you tell us a little bit about your products?
Sure. So right now, because we're an early stage company, what we're popping out as our product and what we're partnering with pharma with is the targets. So whether it's a particular space in RNA or a particular binding protein, we are pumping out these targets that pharma, like Novartis, can partner with us to develop a drug against, and that could span a small molecule, a biologic, in some cases a cell therapy, and so what it's not so much of a drug that we're pumping out, but more so the opportunity to create a drug for something that we identify. Does that make sense? And like I said, a lot of our work is in silico or in computational computational realm. So we're 50-50 wet lab, 50 bioinformaticians, and like I said, most of our product is in reports and analyses.
And who are your customers?
So our customers, at least at present as an early stage company, are big pharma. So we're really trying to work with pharma to develop some of our targets into drugs, or to partner with them on further developing some drugs that we make in-house and design in-house. And so those drugs are predominantly a class of molecule called antisense oligonucleotides, which are a class of RNA-based drugs that can easily target RNA splicing defects. And so those are a little bit more bread and butter to us to design and at least prove out in an in vitro environment, preclinical. But because we're an early stage company, we'll need a partner in a big pharma to take that to IND enabling or phase 1, phase 2 clinical trials.
So we went deep into some products and some technical terms here, but I want to pull it back up again to thinking about when you were looking back, what do you wish you had known prior to your first job? Did both of you have internships? Okay. So let's go back to your first internship. What do you wish you had known? What do you know now that you wish you had known then?
Since it's not scientific, I can.
Yeah, go first.
Yeah, I can hit the science question. Yeah, I was actually quite lucky growing up because my brother was 4 years older than me. So he got to go try stuff and then mess up and then tell me like what I should have done. Like, hey, by the way, before you apply to colleges, why don't you like volunteer for some stuff so they like you? Things like that help. So I've always had, you know, my brother, older brother is a mentor of mine, which is super valuable to have. But I've also had my own learnings as my personality is a little bit different than his. And one learning, because I know you guys are already doing college, but I went then and did my MBA. So when you start doing advanced programs, I didn't think about it at the time, but it's helpful to think about what kinds of companies recruit from those types of schools. So if you do choose to do, you know, a PhD or you do choose to do an MBA, it's helpful to like think about who in the end is going to come to the school to give jobs. So it just makes it easier if they match up with your interests. So like I went to college in Michigan, but then there ended up being a lot of like automotive companies, which wasn't really my thing, but I found a way anyways. And I went to University of Chicago for my MBA, and there again, it wasn't as many East Coast-based companies. There's a lot more industry that's local to the Midwest. So in retrospect, I mean, I love both schools, so I wouldn't change things, but it's something that made me think about it. And then I did the internship in my engineering, but I think the internship in my MBA had a lesson in it because I don't know if there's ever a point in my life where I've been able to answer the question like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like I'm still asking myself the same question. So I don't know if there's ever a point where you will be able to definitively say this is what I want to be when I grow up. It'll be more like what do I want to do next? And during my MBA, I was really conflicted because my brother had gone to business school, and my cousin, and they became investment bankers. And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. I could understand what they did. I was curious, and I found it really interesting. And then I went in, and you have to do a lot of networking. Brown nosing is another word for networking.
I'm not sure if that's PC anymore.
It's not? Yeah. So a lot of networking to get those first interviews, and they're really coveted spots to get an internship at a bank. And I had my first interview, and the guy's like talking to me across the table. I was in my own head. I don't even know what I was saying to him. I was like, I don't want to work with this person. In fact, I don't want to work with any of these people. Like, I just had this epiphany that like, not for me. I don't like any of you. And it's a terrible thing to say because I like my brother. My brother did that. But I learned in that moment that it wasn't for me. And I ended up canceling all my interviews. It was really late in the process. And you can imagine like trying now to backtrack and find other jobs. And I ended up finding a job at Eli Lilly in the Midwest, in Indianapolis, which wasn't where I wanted to be long term. And the CFO of the company was my kind of advisor and mentor. And I had lunch with Charlie Golden, and he said, and I told him, very frankly, I didn't know if I should come back to industry after my full-time, or I still do banking, or I still do consulting. And he's the guy like, I'm supposed to be pitching that I want to come work for him. And he told me a story, like basically when he came out of the Army. And he was selling shoes. And then he became the CFO of one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. He's like, Anuj, don't stress so much about what is going to happen in 10, 20 years from now. Just do something you love next. And don't overthink it. And so he helped me kind of break out of my kind of expectations of myself and that kind of perfectionism of you got to get it right, otherwise the next step's not going to happen. And his story helped me quite a bit. So different space, but kind of the same idea.
Yeah, I think I started pretty early subscribing to that notion of just focusing on what's next. If you look at my past, including all the internships that I did since I was in middle school, high school, it probably looks like an abstract painting. My first internship that I can remember, well, first off, I was an entrepreneur, but before I was an intern. So in middle school, I got a bunch of my friends together, and we, the offices, small offices, were just starting to network their offices with, computers together. And we actually just got together and did small-time jobs for that, and actually I was an entrepreneur before I was an intern. But then my actual first intern was with a digital marketing agency in Manhattan that I got to know through my brothers. And my brothers are both older. I have two of them, and actually one of them was actually similarly a very good mentor to me. And he got me this job with this sort of ad agency that was like a popular tech company in the late 90s or mid 90s. And so it was a lot of fun. It was like, sort of the heyday of Web 1.0 and before the first .com bubble. And I remember that was just sort of a very glamorous job for me because it was the first place where I got to see these workplace perks. And it was strange, they had like it was like a refrigerator that was fully stocked with Arizona iced tea. I remember I was flipping out. I was like, this is all the Arizona iced tea I can drink. And then they had like a masseuse come every Wednesday to sort of de-stress everyone. I was like, what is this place?
What is that place?
Yeah, and it was like a complete open floor office space, kind of like this, where like everyone was working together. It's like, very glamorous. But then I tried other things, right? So I really took advantage of my youth, and I tried anything that I was potentially curious about. So then I was graduating from high school, and I got this wacky idea before starting at Cooper of, I feel like I could use a little bit more engineering prowess. I always wanted to learn how to disassemble an engine to a car, like actually do work on a car. So I had this wacky idea of going around auto body shops around New York City and going up to them and saying, can I have an internship for the summer? Auto body shops aren't the type of place where you go up to them and say, can I have an internship? There's not like an application period. Like most of the people I was talking to were like in overalls and be like, what? And I showed up in like a semi-formal attire. It's like, can I have an internship for this summer before I start college? And I went to like 3 places before I actually got an internship. Like the first place, which was in Chinatown, the guy didn't even speak English. He thought I was insane. The second place thought I was insane as well. And then the third place was a guy who, I remember he was a very kind person, and he said, look, this is a little bit of a weird request, but I think I see where you're going with this. And look, if you want to hang about, the guys could help, use your help on this and that. So I think that speaks to sort of networking and also being brave and a bit courageous when you're putting yourself out there, especially if it's a territory that you don't know much about, you're not speaking with authority on, but you really feel like you want to get involved in. And to this day, it's very much the same, as it was back in high school for me for that experience. So for example, how would I go from a PhD postdoc in biomedical engineering to then working for New York City government and having to build a policy for the city? It's about being a bit courageous and I don't want to say faking it before you make it because that's I don't think that's the case. It's sort of just knowing what you know and working with what you know and then growing from there. So that's sort of the biggest lesson, and I wholeheartedly subscribe to like focusing on what's next for you as opposed to trying to come up with this grand plan.
Hashtag respect the hustle. So I want to turn it over to you all to see what questions you have and give you all a chance to think about a lightning advice round. So what questions do you have for our panelists? What questions do you have for the audience?
What are you excited most about this summer? And do you have any fears about this summer? Or anxieties about this summer? Because, you know. No? Nobody wants to? Okay, there we go.
Michelle?
Otherwise, I'm going to assume that nobody's excited.
Well, that,
Tell your
I think
entire
everyone
class.
in the LifeSci program is very excited, especially after all the great programming that we experienced. I just want to also say thank you guys for coming and sharing your wisdom with us. So something that I'm really excited for this summer is I'm post-sophomore year in college, so I haven't really had any experience, especially coming off of COVID, working in a professional setting. So I'm just really excited to see what a job sphere is like and kind of like how different people's roles, you know, all come together under a company. And then something I'm nervous about is figuring out how what I'm doing does or doesn't like tie into what I want to do going forward, and like how, and then that being said, what I'm going to focus on, obviously aside from the job, like in terms of like networking or strategies or like learning about the environment during the internships, like I guess what additional things I'm going to do, like kind of try to navigate that as we go on in the summer.
Would anyone else like to share what they are excited about or a little nervous about?
Thank you so much for your talk and for this great presentation. I'm so excited about this internship. It's about cancer research, and the position. I found that it's like higher for me. I don't know, because it's in the management, like research project management. I don't have any experience in real experience. I mean, in laboratory about cancer. I had experience from my home country. I was working as a responsible of algal bloom, and when I come here as a mom, I'm raising kids. After that, I have a lot of passion of science, and I want like to contribute to research cancer, because I want to help people that suffer from this disease, and I try to apply for me like internship position about research cancer, and I got this position, and I'm so excited, and also I'm so nervous because like this is my first opportunity here. I'm with different background. I didn't have contact before, and since the pandemic, all my classes are remotely, and I'm like excited, and at the same time I'm a little bit nervous. And also I have another question. I found this opportunity is so excited, and it's gonna help me a lot in my career. And also, like I have a promise of other position. It's like a research assistant in like big company that do research about cancer. And I don't know what I'm gonna do. Like I'm gonna finish first this internship, but I don't know if I want to go for this position and try to work, and at the same time try to be in touch with the company that offered me the internship. And also I try to combine between, but what I did in Morocco, when I was working in microalgae, that gave me the idea to work about the microalgae active biocompound and anti-cancer activity, like to extract some biocompound from microalgae, and like to try to find some biocompound, like alternative way how to treat cancer. That's yeah. Thank you so much.
So, maybe if you have any thoughts on how do you make a decision when you have
one job already in hand and you're going for that, and then there may be something waiting in the wings. Any thoughts on how do you make a decision about which job you go for, or which offer you go for?
So I think there's it's always good to take stock and start your internship and figure out whether you like it or not. So take it step by step. Right? I wouldn't say try to come up with a plan today of which one you're going to go with. You want to be as informed as possible. You also want to think about how each position will also affect your life. I don't know if this is an issue for you, but for me, I've had certain life changes that have happened over the last couple of years, and certainly COVID has taken a lot of toll on sort of everyone's own life preferences. And so each position might offer you a different type of quality of life. So life-work balance is something that might distinguish the two roles. And then you might also want to take into account sort of a path for advancement in each of the roles. So you're taking on this, but then what lies ahead for you and room for growth there. So that's something that my wife actually had to take stock of with both her former employer and then her current employer. That's just sort of 2 or 3 dimensions for you to check yourself on as you're making this decision.
Yeah, maybe a couple related thoughts. Kind of both of your comments. I mean, even at this stage in my career, I read about this word. I was like, this is a good description. Imposter syndrome, where you feel like maybe I'm not good enough, maybe I don't know something. They're gonna find out that like I didn't actually learn the stuff and I can't actually do what they expect out of me. Even though it's been like 3 decades of like going through situation after situation and realizing like, well, I know way more than I thought I did after I got into the situation. It's something to really manage, and it's something to have confidence in yourselves. You guys are super well trained. You're super bright to be in a program like this, and you'll have plenty of time. People don't expect you to know anything on day one. So you'll have a chance to grow and to learn, and in fact, having that kind of beginner's mindset also inspires other people. They're like, oh wow, this person, people love to teach, and people love to give their advice. That's why we're here. Like we want to give back, and we like to share our learnings. It's just something people have. So enjoy that journey of just stepping in, not knowing anything, and having confidence that you'll find your way. I think that's something really important. And then maybe back to the theme I talked about with my MBA internship is, try not to stress too much about there being a perfect answer. Probably what's in your hand is multiple good options. So then you can look at it from that perspective and be like, I'm not going to go wrong with any of these. Which one am I excited about? And then I'll just follow that passion. If I need to pivot one day in the future, I'll be able to pivot. And so it's that kind of living through the positive excitement rather than the anxiety of the stress. I think that's something I wish I could tell myself in the beginning too. Everything works out. You're all super talented.
All right. Well, any other last questions?